Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 225. And today we're going to have a taste of the CG seminar series, which will occur immediately after the Northern Summer on racism and decoloniality in higher education. And to give us that taste today, we have again with us Riyad Shahjahan, who's been a most valued presenter in our seminar series. Riyad's going to talk about a paper which he did with Kirsten Edwards called Whiteness as Futurity and Globalization of Higher Education. And it represents a very strong critique of conventional understandings of globalization. Before I introduce Riyad properly, let me take you through the webinar protocols. The webinar is being recorded, remember, and it'll be posted online on the CG website within 48 hours. That takes you through to the YouTube version. And we're finding that our webinars are being used extensively on YouTube after the event. A transcript of the chat function will also be posted on our website. Now, please keep yourself muted and your camera off unless you've got to the point of coming into the webinar as a participant in the Q&A. We recommend using speaker view in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking, and that's speaker view command is in the top right hand, as you can see on the screen. To ask a question, put your question into the chat. We select the Q&A on the basis of what's coming in through that. And if you come in fairly early towards the end of the speaker's presentation or soon after it, and your question is relevant, then you're almost certainly going to find your way into the Q&A. If you come in very late, you might miss out. So do develop your questions early, and I'll be putting out reminders in the chat about that. When we get to the point where we bring you into the Q&A, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Now, it's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague Riyad Shahjahan, who's been most influential, I think, in shaping our thinking about globalization in the last decade. Riyad is an associate professor of higher adult and lifelong education, HALE, at Michigan State University in the United States. His areas of research interest are in globalization of higher education, decolonizing curriculum and pedagogy, temporality and embodiment in higher education, cultural studies, and and anti-post and post-colonial theory. Riyad, the screen is yours.
Okay. All right, let me quickly share my screen. All right. Good morning to every one of you who are in the Europe. Sorry, good afternoon. I forgot. It's good morning to those of us who are in North America. So that's what shows still waking up, as well as good evening to those who are in Asia, East Asia particularly. It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you, Simon, for the opportunity to present this paper. First of all, I want to quickly give a shout out to my colleague, Kirsten Edwards, who is a co-author of this piece, and she's amidst a move. She just moved into an apartment yesterday, so she couldn't be here, but she will be with us, hopefully, in spirit. So as Simon in his generous introduction mentioned, I've been doing work around globalization of higher education for the past decade. And, you know, there are many issues that have been raised in terms of globalization of higher education, usually there are about 6 phases of globalization of higher ed that's usually discussed. One is the question of technological changes. The second is increased academic mobility, the global knowledge economy, in other words, the political economy of higher education, the role of transnational actors, which is what my area of work has been on, the role of internationalization of curricula, students, as well as partnerships. Those tend to be what has been discussed. But having said that, the question of race and racism in terms of a transnational process has been something that remains unexamined. Now, having said that, most critical race discussions of global higher education has focused particularly within national containers, and particularly in relation to international students and faculty in terms of what happens to them as they enter a national container, and the race and racism that they experience through institutions, through interpersonal relationships, things like that. So our paper here is to help us push beyond that, to move beyond methodological nationalism. And basically the kind of argument we want to make here is that we cannot look at racial dynamics and inequities in a given society by and assume that it just emanates solely from logic structures bounded in a national container. And so this is what the purpose of this paper is to do, is to push that. So another thing I want to kind of clarify is oftentimes the globalization of higher education, and Simon and I, we talk about this a lot. Globalization of higher education tends to be conflated with internationalization of higher education, and I see them as being distinct. And so by globalization here, I'm referring to the possibilities of relations and agency that span, flow, and or ignore the nation state. In other words, it moves beyond this ontological standpoint of the world being governed in terms of just nation states, but also includes flows and disjunctures of culture, capital, technology, media, and the role of non-higher education transnational actors such as publishing companies, such as the OECD, World Bank, and so forth. But also there's a question of agency in terms of that these forces, relations are also mitigated locally within the higher education sectors and institutions globally. So the focus of our paper is simply the notion of, again, as I said, the globalization of higher education, but particularly we look at how whiteness shapes racial asymmetries and futurity orientation. And basically what our conceptual paper here is arguing is that whiteness as futurity colonizes or simply orients global subjects, imaginaries, and reinforces the asymmetrical movements, networks, and untethered economies underpinning global higher education. And by subjects, we're not just simply referring to just individuals. We're referring to subjects as being those who are subject to these such forces, such as institutions, nation states, policymakers, and so forth. Okay. So what do we mean by whiteness? So oftentimes when people discuss whiteness, they think whiteness is all about white people or white identity formation and so forth. But we move beyond that. We're referring to a set of narrative structural positions, rhetorical tropes, and habits of perception that stands in the normal. In other words, it's a form of ideology. But also whiteness is a state of knowing and being that privileges white people, institutions, and cultural norms, and is part of a superstructure. Particularly, it's a superstructure because whiteness is very much intertwined with racial capitalism. In other words, the capitalism that we have today could not happen without whiteness, and therefore they are intertwined. Whiteness, according to Sarah Ahmed, is unfinished business that orients the social and political environments towards the benefit and protection of white life. So what we did in this paper is we tried to bring together critical whiteness studies with temporal studies to kind of offer a framework that kind of helps to unpack the ways in which the globalization of whiteness governs the future. And these are three processes, and they might be distinct, but they're also very much intertwined. One, whiteness is a producer and foreclosure of aspirations. Two, whiteness as investment, and finally, whiteness as malleable. And I'm going to talk about each one of these components next. So before I go into this, just to push our thinking beyond the notion of whiteness as something that just happens within, white settler context, or whiteness is something that just happens in Anglo context and it's not prevalent in other places. I want us to kind of look at this chart that Michelle Christian put together in her piece on the global field of whiteness. And in this, I want to point to three points. One is that why whiteness? Whiteness is the foundation of all racialized social systems since modernity, okay? And so what you'll see here is that the countries are arranged in a particular way. And again, this is not static, but it gives you a sense of those who are considered the whitest of the white: US, UK, Western Europe, Australia, and so forth. And Canada could be up there too. and that each of these regions and countries are to some extent negotiating their global racial positions. And here I'm putting nation states, but one can think of institutions from these regions. You can think of higher education subjects, individuals also trying to negotiate themselves within this global field and trying to negotiate their global racial position by deploying different forms of racial capital, either symbolic, economic, cultural, social, or aesthetic. But the second point about this is that this global field of whiteness is refracted and inflected with national, local racial orders. And so this is where the groups, if you look at the left part of this chart, the bottom part shows that it's not something that's not an equal playing field. Global field of whiteness, while it could be differentiated in terms of nations and regions, but within the national containers themselves, there are racial hierarchies. So when we talk about China, we're really talking about Han Chinese. When we're talking about India, we're often really talking about high caste Indians. And then in Ethiopia, or the whole region of Habasha. So it's really important to think about global field of whiteness is not just something that happens across beyond just nation states, but within, and how they're refracted and reproduced through their interconnections with the racial social orders that are built within the national containers in the regions. Now, the other point is that one of the things is, while one can acquire a form of whiteness in one space, that can evaporate in another when they travel across the space. So for instance, those who are in the Gulf states might have access to whiteness because of the ethnic group, the tribal group that they're part of, but then when they move to the UK, they become the racial other. In other words, whiteness it gives them privilege within their own national containers, but as they move, that shape shifts, and it can happen from one region to another. Okay. Similarly, people from the United States can have a certain form of whiteness. Working class folks moving to Japan might have a different form of racial capital by moving to Japan, even though they might be working class in the United States. So that just gives you some sense of how this is a dynamic process. So whiteness, as I said, the first component is as a producer and foreclosure of aspirations. So one of the things with a lot of the critical race studies is that the preoccupation with a racist past suggests that simply we can fix it by future resolution. In other words, racism is of the past, and as we've moved forward, racism is much better. We're colorblind. There's so many other kinds of languages used, multiculturalism and so forth. But what it does, these narratives, while very important, they also obscure how the future also reproduces race and racism. And how? Well, that's because whiteness, since modernity, has discursively represented status, desirability, development, and global power. And this is why global subjectivity and mobility push locals towards white aspirations and futures, because of the way it's discursively represented and its connections to status, desirability, power, and so forth. And so some examples of that, and many of you are familiar with, is, for instance, the role of English language, how many people are, want to aspire, consider English as being intelligence in certain parts. But again, these are languages that come from the whitest of whiteness. If you look at the chart earlier, the role of TOEFL, comprehensive research universities, becoming the model. When we think of branch campuses, who do you partnership with, which countries, so forth. This is the way a particular aspiration is there, that is what people are trying to jockey towards. So according to Sarah Ahmed, performance is an orientation towards the future, as the action is an expression of wish or intention. In other words, all kinds of actions we take has some temporal elements to it. But as we are trying to move towards a particular thing, we are also, to some extent, trying to fulfill a particular future ideal. So another component of the whiteness as futurity is whiteness as investment. And what we suggest is globalization of higher education is a process through which white investment expansion happens. And it's a process that enhances predictive capacity. These are future-oriented practices and anticipatory logics. I'll talk a little bit about that. But it enhances predictive capacity in accessing the global economy and market. And as I said, whiteness cannot be separated from racial capitalism, right? And so the future is often rendered knowable through specific practices, and in turn shapes the present through anticipatory practices such as precaution. We're concerned, by investing in whiteness, we are trying to prevent falling down, preemption, preparedness. These are all important parts through which the future governs the present. A good example of that is that many countries around the world are investing in branch campuses. The idea of trying to do internationalization at home is a means to attract the global market to their higher education sectors. And the way to do that is to invest in whiteness. White bodies are also invest in a racialized value system to secure material advantages because it provides structural advantages. For instance, the notion of language, English language helps people to move around easily. It's like a blue passport, like, US passport that allows you to enter parts of the world that might not be as possible for other people with other citizenships. Non-white bodies also feel compelled to invest because they gain advantages in relation to others. Through investments in whiteness. And so you see that in terms of how people moving particular directions in the world, though that's changing, and I'll talk a little bit about that, in order to gain this whiteness capital, in order to enjoy capitalist employment and economics advantages, as well as, of course, social as well as material advantages that go with it. And in doing so, whiteness and investment, as that happens, you adopt white parameters such as curricular, language, mobility, which allow marginalized nations and groups to participate in a global economy and increase our dependence on this imagined security. And so, this is an important part because the most prized global worker is one possessing white national citizenship as well as white higher education institution credentials. And if you have both, great, but if white higher education institution credentials gives you a global currency to move around in this, as I mentioned earlier, the global field of whiteness. But also whiteness is malleable. What does that mean? Whiteness is deep as well as malleable. Is to recognize that even if there are spaces where white bodies are not prevalent in terms of institutions, people, and so forth are not prevalent, it still is prevalent because it is appealing to non-white bodies because it places objects, resources within reach. And so this happens because, again, whiteness is very much intertwined. Even if you're talking about the nation state, it is a European paradigm that was spread around the world as a social political arrangement. Hence, methodological nationalism is a modernity project. The state, the economics, the social power, aesthetics are all tied to white power. In doing so, white bodies want to be closer. And so one way through why certain regions invest in whiteness is to make it reachable. So let me just give you some examples. So for instance, many are talking about how mobility is shifting eastward, how in global forms of rankings are going up, so-called eastward. But in doing so, what we're not thinking about is these non-white bodies from Southeast Asia or Africa, as they're moving eastward, it's because Singapore, China, and stuff are making whiteness more reachable in those regions. Similarly, when you think of hubs such as Singapore, such as the UAE, again, it allows whiteness to be within reach, and they market themselves, the Boston of the East, things like that. Okay? Whiteness is evolving and is temporal, shifting from the past by accommodating local particularities, regional hierarchies to reproduce itself in the future. It projects itself in various futures. And so one way as the advantage it gives to, for instance, white subjects is through study abroad in the United States that gives students, white subjects, a flavor of the world to help their capacity to enter the global labor market, for instance, right? while particular pursuits may end up as amalgamations between Western ideals and local customs, for instance, the question of rankings, the question of curricula, the question of even language, English language and institutions, they all begin from a white orientation. In other words, the question we're asking is, where are we starting from? Where are we starting from? Which protects the long-term security of whiteness. And so in order to kind of make this clearer, we're going to, we chose two global trends that are happening. One is the global diffusion of liberal education, and the other is the growing use of global university rankings to highlight how whiteness as futurity operates in terms of the ways in which curricula moves, as well as how global metrics are also moving around the world and shaping, shape-shifting, as well as in terms of the decision-making happening in various contexts. So we'll start with liberal education. So it's interesting, you know, liberal education, this is a more recent phenomenon, particularly in the past 2 decades, but more recently, more in the past decade itself. We see proliferation of liberal education in many regions that rarely existed before. This ranges from all the way from India, Brazil, Ghana, China, Chile, Bangladesh, Russia, so forth. But what is happening is liberal education also situates the non-white subject in relation to whiteness, particularly an access to the global economy. So one way in which it works in terms of liberal education as something that people are investing in, but is a form of aspiration, is this idea of being able to be a global employee. Is one way to become a global employee, particularly in many other parts of the world, is through a liberal education. And this is particularly salient as liberal education is touted and sold as preparation for the fourth industrial revolution, global marketplace. The fourth industrial revolution, for those who might be consider what it is, this is where the importance of data, and data has become the new oil of the new market, and the role of AI, big data, and so forth has become a huge part. But what happens is that, again, it's tied to this notion of futurity. This is the new phase of the economy coming up. And in order to preempt and be prepared for it, we need to invest in liberal education. And so liberal education becomes this preparatory route to entering or to get ready for this upcoming economy for in some places that's already emergent or already here. Also, the assumption is that liberal education espouses democratic values. And so, you know, things like critical thinking, multiple perspectives, and so forth are embedded in liberal education. But in doing so, what it does is it perpetuates racialized hierarchies. How so? Number one, it assumes that these notions of critical thinking and multiple perspectives does not happen in other local knowledge systems. Number two, and I'll talk a little bit about that, it is very much an elite form of education because not many students, particularly in non-white regions, can access this because it's often in private systems. But also it's branded. It's the language of liberal education is used as a form of branding to secure markets in national containers, even though they may not have the components of liberal education. So basically what it does is it gives non-white bodies proximities to education models that would access them to the current and future global economy. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the ways it does the racialized hierarchies are reproduced is it reproduces classist social arrangements in non-white futures through private and elite schooling. When you look at a lot of liberal education schools around the world, they often are private. They're often very much tuition based. They're not usually, even though some of it is in particular exclusive public universities, these are very exclusive universities themselves. So liberal education is a great example of a malleable product that accommodates misaligned value systems and appears accessible. Again, as I said, liberal education has become the new brand for global or signaling one is international. But even though local knowledge systems are the predominant face of the curricula there, but it provides, again, a form of branding to access a global market. Another way in which liberal education is propagated is through investments in English. Again, helps to protect white futures. But so while well, as I said earlier, it's espoused liberal education provides democratic values, so forth, things like that. It's really about investing in neoliberal subjectivity and allowing access to a larger global labor market as well as a global economy. And a good example of this is, I took students to Japan, took our students to Japan, and one of the colleagues at Naga University says, what is the difference in internationalization between what you guys do in Michigan State, and you're not concerned about that we need to worry about in Japan? And our students couldn't figure out what he was asking or didn't provide the right responses, but what he said is language. Language is the major factor that you don't have to deal in the United States that we have to deal with when we're talking internationalization in Japan, because if you're trying to attract students across the world, English is what we need to focus on. And so that gives you an example of how English is a very much an important part of entering the global marketplace, that it privileges certain regions over others. Now, this is the area of my work that's been something I've been focusing on previously for the past, I would say, 5 years, is to look at global university rankings and how global university rankings represents a way to enact or adopt a future self. In other words, the way we want to be in the future, the ideal future self. And by future self, I'm not just talking about individuals, I'm talking about, again, nation states, talking about also institutions. And to become a global subject is to basically become white. And so what we're going to show next is that GURs are oriented around and toward white bodies, and I'll show how. But what's important is one participates in global university rankings because it's an aspiration to become visible in this global field of whiteness. So how is GURs and whiteness orientation intertwined? Well, one is global university rankings has its historical roots in white histories. And so one way to think about that is when you think of just university ranking in general, forget the global part, just university rankings, the first of its kind emerged between the 1860s and 1920s in the US and UK, and they were part of the eugenics movements. At this point, statistical science was a very prevalent thing, which was concerned with the decline of great men. And so these scientists and social scientists were really seeking to reproduce white men. And so one example of this is James Cattell, who drew upon eugenics and theoretical and methodological considerations to redirect this idea of moving away from, how do you produce these white eminent men? Where do they come from? Instead of focusing on individuals, what he did, and if you look at on your right side at the below, he produced this ranking, the scientific strength of a leading institution. This became his form of rankings. It was one of the first rankings to see which institutions would do the best job in creating the best crop of white eminent men. And that's where the first form of rankings comes from in terms of universities. But also, future success in global higher education is rooted in whiteness. And a great example is the Shanghai University rankings. As some of you, and I'm sure many of you know better than me, the Shanghai rankings was built on a template as they were trying to negotiate how to form a ranking locally. But the template that was used was to use the research universities that come from mostly America and the UK. So again, whiteness becomes the template to what to aspire towards. And though it's something that's produced in China, it was where you start from, again, comes from the white world. Another way to see how whiteness orientation is prevalent in global university rankings is evident in who or which bodies succeed in such rankings. As many of you noticed, the top 10 and the big 3 rankings, and by big 3, I'm talking about ARWU, Times Higher Education, as well as QS, are derived from particular regions of 2 countries, Southern England and the USA. And even in the USA, it's the West and East Coast. And many of these come with their predominantly white institutions with huge endowments and so forth. But particularly, it's very interesting for some of you who may not be aware, in the East Coast, such as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, that tends to be dominating these rankings. These are institutions, predominantly white institutions, whose endowments are all tied to the Atlantic slave trade. And this is something that many people around the world are not aware of, is that the so-called big universities that we see that is emulated, particularly in the United States, is tied to this transnational Atlantic slave trade. Okay. Another way through which the whiteness orientation is reproduced is as national actors play catch up in global university rankings and claim to be world class. And so basically, whiteness becomes the mirror to evaluate where a nation or institution stands and should go. So there are many investments in various ways in, to secure a position in global university rankings. All tend to be oriented to white bodies. And by white bodies, I'm talking about white institutions and nation states. So higher education institutions, this is just national actors, and this can happen through internationalization and so forth, which I'll talk about a little bit, but also investments, such as right now, India has come up with institutions of eminence. You hear these new clubs that each nation state, you have the I-150 in Russia, in Japan has its own, like China, like all these different projects in terms of these world-class movements. And other institutions like Kazakhstan invested in Nazarbayev as this to prop up a big research university so that they can be visible in the global higher education sector. So higher education institutions are also investing in whiteness, solidifies as institutions increasingly turn into or are considered global subjects and trying to negotiate, and in doing so, negate local missions and autonomy. And this is interesting. Those who are investing in whiteness are already elite institutions. Even if they're public, they often are the most exclusive ones that are trying to jockeying itself in a global field of whiteness. So one way it does that, as I said, whiteness is a form of not just aspiration, but also an investment, is through investing in international efforts, such as recruitment of academic stars, international collaboration efforts, English coursework. And so some of you are like, well, what about all those non-white nations that are catching up in GURs? And I have a couple of responses to that. First of all, the orientation to whiteness still, as Futurity still remain, as I said, ARW, THE, QS are still based on white epistemologies and ontologies. Number two is that this catching up in GURs is also representative of specific racialized groups that achieve top hierarchical racial category status and meaning during their country's global and national racialized processes. So in other words, when we say China, what we're really referring to is Han China. Okay. The same thing when we're talking about Japanese, we're not talking about Brazilian Japanese, we're talking about the notion of the monolithic Japanese. So this is just some examples I'm talking about, is when we talk about non-white nations, we need to move away from this idea of a national container being a monolithic thing, but also representatives of racial hierarchies within those national containers themselves. So in many ways, catching up in GURs is also a way to reassert oneself in one's ethnic superiority in state building practices. So with that, I'm going to end. Globalization, we argue, is a technology of race and temporality that cannot be easily separated. Future orientations act like a mirror that in a way, reflects back to us what this optimum future looks like governing our present. And that in critical whiteness studies, we need to think about the role of affect and visibility. In other words, how does the hope, pride, shame, fears of the future shape our subjectivity today? And that's what we need to make more visible. We also need to consider transnational racialization processes underpinning policies and practices in higher education that have global faces, such as branding and mediatization of higher education. And particularly individuals in the global north need to interrogate their own global privileges, even if they aren't white, and that we need to also consider the ultimate orientation governing the production of hybrids. And with that, I will end, and thank you for being here. And this just gives you a sense of the major references that we use to produce this framework are Ahmed, Andrew Baldwin, Michelle Christian, and George Lipsett's work in order to build our framework. With that, I will end and open to questions and comments. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing here.
Well done, Riyad. Thank you very much. Great paper. And I found this paper, which I read in May or late April, very convincing. And I think it helped me to bring whiteness right to the center of my understanding of globalization, that it's not something which is a kind of pathology of the political economy, but it's integral to the way power works. And one of the things that convinced me of that from the paper was the point about how it shapes mobility aspirations amongst non-white populations. And you think of the present situation, for example, I mean, coming out of the pandemic, I mean, who's done well in the pandemic and who hasn't? The English-speaking Anglo-American countries have made an awful mess of it and are unsafe places to be by comparison with East Asia, where Japan and China are, and to a lesser extent Taiwan, are significant international education locations, and also the Nordic countries, Denmark, for example, and Germany have on the whole managed the pandemic better and they're safer places to be. But, you know, the demand pattern is springing back again, you know, to where it was, with the US and the UK having this overwhelming predominance, and Australia, Canada, New Zealand also enjoying the benefits of that whiteness as well, that priority given to English-speaking Anglo-American countries that have ruled the world for 200 years. And, you know, you can understand it in relation to the United States, because the United States still offers the migrant, temporary or permanent, a lot of opportunities in terms of a very large labour market, very varied, and relatively open to the newcomer compared to some other countries. But the UK, which is, you know, left Europe, has been pretty tough on migrants, until recently wasn't allowing international students to stay, or at least was very difficult for them to do so, is also a demand magnet in much the same ways as always has been. And, you know, the UK has been able to actually increase its international student numbers while everyone else has been reducing them. It shows how powerful the demand is in these countries. And, you know, it can only be explained, I think, when you look, it's not explicable entirely in terms of political economy. Clearly, in the case of the UK, there are other places in the world which offer more opportunities, but it makes sense when you factor in the whiteness aspect. And also, you know, the hub logics. Singapore, a brilliant country in terms of its achievements. You know, Singapore's research universities, on most measures, at least in STEM, are in the top 15. The two of them are in the world, and Singapore is a pristine environment, which is a very safe place to be, very high standard of living, very nice place to be an international student for all those kinds of reasons. But Singapore felt compelled to bring in the Euro-American countries into its global schoolhouse strategy in large numbers. It had to populate the Singapore global schoolhouse strategy with these icons of whiteness, these great famous names from Europe and America. And again, that wouldn't have been necessary, would it? If you just look at it in terms of the pure merits of the case, Singapore was quite capable of carrying the hub role on its own, except for the whiteness factor. It's the thing that explains so many other things. It fills a gap in our understanding of globalization. That's not a question, I think, Riyad. There was a kind of statement, but I better at this point.
Yeah, just quickly to say, you know, here we just talked in this particular paper. We have another paper coming out, which is very interesting what you just talked about mobility. So in this paper, we looked at the way curriculum moves as well as metrics are moving. But the particular paper that's going to come out looks at exactly what you're talking about, the question of mobility. But mobility is not just the mobility of bodies. Mobility is also the mobility of imaginaries, right? And this is where the role, and I think in higher education, we're not doing a very good job, the role of popular culture. Popular culture shapes aspirations. So the way when you're talking about the global demands of UK and so forth, this is integral part of popular culture. Many of my students, when they come in undergrad and I ask them, what do you know about higher education? Their responses is from the movies and magazines and the stuff I watch, the role of social media. These are very important ways in which people's aspirations are built from childhood. And so, and their histories with families and so forth. So when you say, even though there are visa restrictions, people will work hard to access those spots because of the access to the global economy that I talked about. But number two, it's because of that, again, that aspiration, that security that is reproduced through popular culture. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Riyad. I'd like to bring in Glenn Chatelia, and he'll be followed by Aki Yanazawa. So Glenn, you have the first question.
Thank you, Simon, and thanks, Riyad. It's a very engaging presentation that you've made. However, I look at your entire topic and its exploration in this whiteness and globalization really as a grand hypothesis which really needs to be reworked, given the temporality as one of the conditions that you use in the argumentation. And we really are in a state of flux right now. Granted that much of the global influence has derived from Western expertise or the white expertise, but given the global pandemic, we see two things happening. Number one, the new technologies of connectivity, and you might add in artificial intelligence in the future, big data, connectivity, and all of that stuff are going to be strong factors to look at in the first place. And secondly, the shift in global focus away from the traditional white West to the Asia Pacific, which arguably for the present is dominated by China, but in the future, I think would become more intercultural or multicultural as it gains more, let's say, a pivoting attraction. Okay, and I'm just wondering whether your study, would look at factors beyond whiteness or the current appeals of globalization, to look at these other factors, okay, the game-changing factors, and how exactly do we in the education world prepare for that? Would it lead then to a stronger case for interculturality in our academic approaches? Whereas now it's concentrated mostly on whiteness as doing the best thing, right? But I mean, there are wisdoms that accrue and accumulate from even the other cultures that are emerging and becoming stronger. I do not know whether I've been lucid enough for you, but please, if you can comment on this or retort, I would be very happy. Thank you. Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, so Glenn, as we said in our paper, we're talking about not just whiteness as something static, but whiteness as shape-shifting. And we talked about the malleability of whiteness. The example of moving eastward, to me, is not convincing to show that whiteness is being dismantled, because whiteness morphs and shape shifts. Now, does that mean that certain local knowledge systems are privileged? Yes, to some extent. But our point about whiteness as futurity is, what is the orientation? Now, it's interesting you bring up the question of new technologies and big data. I gave a keynote about this topic around the ways which a calculated way of being is still a colonial way of being. In other words, datafication algorithms are all based about producing calculable worlds. Now, calculable worlds, this idea of creating calculable world, is an anthropocentric notion that is not shared by all cultures around the world. When you have cultures that look at not just relationships as commodities, but as relationships, then you would not have AI existing in the first place. So my point is that whiteness still shapeshifts and morphs. And I don't think these are new factors in our paper. We do address particularly the movement towards eastward. I don't talk about big data, but it is I would argue, in many ways reproduces whiteness to futurity, particularly in terms of the economy and the ways we prepare for it.
Thanks, Riyad, and thanks, Glenn. Aki Yanazawa, you have the next question, Aki.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Riyad. And actually, my question, konbanwa. Let's meet again. My question is actually highly similar with the grants discussion. It is related to the digitalization and AI. But I know that your theory is not exactly mentioning about the kind of the physical whiteness, but much more like a hegemonical relationship with and I think it is really, really persuasive. And as you may know, as you know, based on your experience in Japan and my experience in other outside of Japan, is that there is a very big differences still that the Japan, for example, Japan is a country that has a relatively homogeneous, we call, or the very, very strong monoculture orientation. And from this point of view, that the, for example, United States is hierarchical, hegemonical, but still quite multicultural. And this is really big differences. Adding to that, within the multicultural hegemony, I feel that there are some big game shift and the dynamism, and it is not exactly as you already mentioned, that the static, and that this itself is really the big challenge for the existing hierarchy. So that is the meaning that maybe the Glenn and myself are talking about. So let me ask the same question maybe again, that this kind of dynamism may really change the global hegemony within a very long time, like 10 years or 20 years, just like the Eastern world really lose the kind of a hegemonical power in the 19th century. So that is what I would like to ask you again.
Sure. So, I mean, the question is really about power. What do we mean by power? So if we're talking about material power, yes, someone could argue that, of course, that the power is shifting in terms of geopolitics, right? But what we're talking about is the question of futurity, is what is the orientation? So we can go around changing, like, this is the kind of arguments that many critical race theorists would talk about, multicultural discourses, that it's one thing to say, hey, let's put Black Lives Matter and put Black History Month for 1 month, right? But the current curriculum doesn't really shift. The content changes, but the terms of the curriculum is not really shifting. Right. So similarly, you can talk about, when I showed you the chart of the global field of whiteness, yes, you can see China moving around or Japan moving up or whatever, though I would say Japan is declining to some extent. Right. But in terms of the jockeying, the aspiration is what? That's what we are trying to critique here. Yes, people moving around here could be shifting, but the orientation, what is the ideal, is what we're saying is still colonized by whiteness. So it's one thing to think about social material relationships through whiteness as existing or present or past conditions. But what we are arguing is this is why temporal studies become so important, that futurity is something that is still there. Will it shift in 20, 50 years? Yes, but my argument, or our argument, is we're still stuck. Because when we look at racism as something of the past or the present, and we're not looking at how race and racism is shaping futurity, then we are going to continue to be stuck at just moving around the content of the conversation, but not the actual terms of the conversation. Does that help to?
Yeah. I do understand. Okay, thank you.
Now, next question is Soyoung Lee.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Riyad, for your presentation. So my question is about your last comment at the end of your presentation. At the end of your presentation, you said that the ultimate orientation of this futurity and this global science could be the production of hybrids. And then thinking about the hybrids made me think, because this development of and rapid development of global science and globalization of higher education could be driven by having this whiteness as the ultimate goal of this development. If we think that the production of hybrids as the ultimate goal of this higher education, then do you think the higher education system in the world would still have some shared goals that drive them to work hard to, I don't know, to develop? Then what would be the aspirations? Do you think global higher education would still have aspiration if they do not have, I mean, if they have hybrids as the ultimate goal of this system?
Yeah, so I mean, hybrids is one thing. I mean, there are different types of hybrids, and we're talking about how the malleability of whiteness allows hybrids to be there, but look local, right? But the point is, we can have lots of types of hybrids. That's okay. The question is, what is valued? So you can have Confucius centers and so forth, right? You can have different types of institutions have local languages and so forth. But the question is, what is valued? What is valued in the global economy? What is valued in the so-called intelligent economy that many of my colleagues are asking about? That's where we have issues in terms of how whiteness still is the road to that the hybrids that may have malleable whiteness and so forth does not provide that same access to. And so that's why we cannot separate questions of whiteness from the racial economy that is already there, that constantly reproduces itself. The second thing I wanted to point out about hybrids is let me just give you an example, because I see there's a kind of common trend in the question, is that the kind of affective responses we have to whiteness. We want to defend it, we want to critique it and so forth. But like, some of my colleagues talked about in this new issue that's coming on in higher education, mobility, they talk about how there are certain regions that are given positive emotions, and there are certain regions, if you move to, you're considered stuck, or you have negative emotions, right? And so when you might have hybrids, people still feel like that's not good enough. They don't have that same positive emotions attached to it. So being, talking about whiteness is not just something where you can just talk about structures and so forth. There are also invisible ontological components to it. The notion of being, the notion of being calculating, the notion of positive emotions to certain structures over others, right? Is something that we need to grapple with before we talk about hybrids.
Yes. I mean, the point about sort of dominance of white ontology explains a lot of other things, doesn't it? I mean, whiteness helps to explain why the indigenization of higher education in East Asia has been slow, despite the fact that the political economy, the capacity of the East Asian systems is now great, and it has been in Japan for quite a long time, and it's now great in Korea and China as well. Global whiteness is blocking also the process whereby the strong East Asian systems can take their ideas, their models, their approaches out into the world as potentially strong models at world level. I mean, global whiteness sort of blocks that process of going out, that sort of passage, so that the process of going out from East Asia has to be reworked in terms of whiteness and Euro-American prototypes. Our next contributor to the discussion is Alejandra Barlet. Alejandra.
Hi, well, thank you so much for the talk. I am feeling extremely white today, being a Brazilian working at the University of Edinburgh. So I can feel the impact of your talk already on me and my experience as well. But what I do wonder is, what are the boundaries when we think about this, if there is any? And the reason I ask, it is because when we think about what one can do and what one wants to do, we understand the boundaries of history, we understand the boundary of colonization, of the narratives that come across centuries, and the truths that are out there that we think that are the best. Exactly what you were saying now about the whiteness. I understand as well that there is an incredible effort from many colleagues trying to question that in terms of the colonial ideas, in terms of post-colonial ideas, in terms of indigenous studies, and a number of new epistemologies, new because of the effort that they have to make in order to be valued, as you just mentioned now, again, which I do agree. But where is the limit in terms of, do these ideas, do these reactions, these critical positionings, do they have to come out of a permission from whiteness then to exist? Are we working because we are allowed by the narrative to, well, yes, you can talk about your indigenous knowledges, that's okay, but when you publish, I need you to talk about critical discourse analysis. Go away with that.
Yeah.
So my question is there a limit? Because if we have a limit, where is the role of agency? Because we can't just assume that we are just going to be swallowed by this massive, we already are swallowed by history and by everything that has happened in the world. But do we have a way to, first of all, is there a limit to all of this? And how worthy is the efforts that we have to cross it? Thank you.
Yeah, Alejandra, thank you so much for those questions and sharing your own social positionality. It is a struggle for those of us who are coming from minoritized groups and bodies, as we are trying to question questions of whiteness, but are also very much a complicit as well as value and the structural advantage. You talked about working at University of Edinburgh. I work at a Research One institution that is one of those that are emulated as part of these global university rankings and so forth. So there are definitely critiques to it. I think the question I'm trying to raise, and I think this is where we're struggling, is it's one thing to say to shift the content, change the ingredients, but not change the stove or the pots that we use. And so when you say the question of limits, that's where the limits start coming in. For instance, as you said earlier, when you want to publish stuff on indigenous knowledges, you have to do it again in white parameters. One is, first, it's writing in an English language, being oral, forget oral traditions, the questions of aesthetics and so forth. It has to be logocentric. It has to be particular empirical evidence. So absolutely. And that's why we talk about whiteness as not just something that's structural, but as a way of knowing and being is important to it. But I think your question also raises the affective components. In other words, what do we feel? How do we feel? And the limits that you talk about comes up when our feelings, the risk taking, we become scared, right? In other words, if we are not catching up, will we be left behind? That's a very scary connotation. But the thing is, what whiteness does is provides us that imagined security. But with that said, I think the limits is the consequences we're seeing around the world. The environmental crisis that we're seeing, the question of how certain bodies are being pillaged in forms of resource extraction and so forth, right? That happen to be minoritized bodies. But also, I think it's really important that when I say whiteness, I'm not talking about just white bodies in the traditional sense. You said about being white Brazilian. I'm talking about racial hierarchies within nation states that are appropriating whiteness to jockey itself while discriminating and marginalizing groups underneath it, right? And so those who are facing those material consequences are forced. Now, many people talk about agency as something that is subversive, but agency is also a form of conformity. People conform to survive. So I know there's a lot of talk about critical agency and so forth, and I see some questions around structure and agency. Agency is also conformity. Most of the time when we're being agents, we're conforming because it's also a form of survival, right? And also there's a lot of limits to modernity. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's definitely paradoxes that we also are implicit and struggling with ourselves.
Thank you, Alejandra, and thank you, Riyad. Of course, we've got time probably for one or two more, and then we better wrap up. But What I think I'll do, Riyad, with your indulgence, is read out a question from Jack Lee, because Jack can't put his question into sound form because he's on a train, which is very noisy. He's asked me to read it out. And I'll also invite in Eliel Cohen as well. Both, I think, are like a number of others in the questioning, are looking for ways through, ways out of this situation that you've so eloquently described today. Now, Jack's question goes like this. I'm also interested in agency versus structure, as sort of whiteness is seen here as structure, as the latter seems quite deterministic and path dependent. In hubs like Singapore and Qatar, there's tremendous complicity amongst local policymakers to perpetuate whiteness. But is it whiteness, or rather is it epistemology? That's Jack's question. Now let me bring in Eliel, and then you could respond to both. Eliel, can you come in, please?
Hello, thank you, Simon. And yeah, thanks for this presentation. Yes, I think Simon probably framed and introduced my question quite well. So just, yeah, thinking about what other concepts there are or ideas to engage with, which alternative ways of thinking about futures, or of even starting to think about futures. And just one, as you were presenting, just one author that came to mind was D'Souza Santos, and he speaks about solidarity as a state of knowing and sites of kind of neo-communities, which is, for me, a concept which I've really struggled to fully understand what he means by that. But certainly they're not, he doesn't present them as kind of ideal communities, but certainly kind of emancipatory communities to the extent that they are anti-colonial and they are grounded in immediate context, but which think about the future. So I'm just wondering if you've got thoughts on that, or other authors in mind, or other concepts of yourself that you're developing. Sorry about my screen. I've been having this issue for a while. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jack. Jack's work I actually cite in our mobility piece. So it's interesting he's raising this question about hubs and so forth in our mobility piece. I think it's really important to differentiate the layers of whiteness we're talking about. Whiteness is not just some kind of deterministic thing. Whiteness, as I said, is malleable, therefore it's shape-shifting, therefore it's transient, it shifts, moves around. But also, as I mentioned, whiteness is a way of knowing and being. And so while I agree to some extent, indeed, there are forms of agency, but the question of agency is, where does it start from? What is orienting that agency? That's the problem we're trying to pose here. Now, if the orientation is shifting, that's wonderful. The problem is those orientations are what's being dismantled or pushed aside because of the relationship between whiteness and racial capitalism. That's one way of thinking about it. But the other thing is, talking about decolonial movements and so forth. I mean, I have a piece that just got accepted yesterday on decolonizing curriculum pedagogy. We looked at it in terms of decolonizing around the world. What does it mean? And what does it look like across disciplines in global higher education context as a means to, if you want to talk about a combat so-called whiteness, people talk about these decolonial movements. Now, yes, there are these alternative ways in which pedagogy and curriculum are being enacted. And oftentimes they're happening in micro settings. So maybe that's one way of thinking about agencies, those micro settings. But in a global scale, what we're seeing, and one of the resistance is students. One of the examples we show is student resistance is one of the common cited themes in terms of decolonizing curriculum pedagogy. And students from the global South are resisting decolonizing curriculum. Why? Because they're concerned of not having access to the global labor market. And so there are studies showing about engineering in South Africa, where students were, while many students are like, yes, we love the idea of localizing alternative ways of knowing and so forth, it's great. But there are other students who are very concerned that, yes, if we localize and make this Chinese or whatever in other contexts, will we have access to the global economy? And that's what I'm concerned about. is that even if we're talking about shifting towards an intelligent economy and datafication, though then again, looking at Paul Prinslow's work, that is not something that provides an equitable world in terms of the race and racism that is tied to algorithms. And China is a wonderful example in which the surveillance capitalism and nation state surveillance is very much intertwined. The question to me is, yes, there are these local kinds of, and Sousa Santos talks about the abyss. In other words, we cannot see alternatives because even the terms of seeing the alternatives comes from whiteness. And so to some extent, we have to take risks. We have to be okay with not knowing. And I think that's what I would argue, is if you're trying to look for alternatives, maybe the alternative is not in the cages we're in, but beyond. But in order to get beyond, we have to shift towards multiple ways of knowing and being. And one example I argue, and I'm not saying that's the answer, please don't see it. I argue in my paper, Being Lazy and Slowing Down, to empty the need for a result with the passage of time. Empty the need for a result with passage of time. Can we embrace that? And if we can't, why not? And that's one of, I'm not saying that's the solution. I'm just saying that is an example of how hard it is to empty the need for a result, because everything we do is so outcome oriented. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, that last point about outcome orientation. And, we have to free ourselves from the notion that we can control and predict the future and make ourselves safe that way, because we can't. The future is unforeseeable. And I think that in that, if you like, does lie the hope that people are looking for in this conversation, that, that things will change. They will open up in ways we can't foresee now. I mean, one of the things that I think is reasonably certain is that, to the extent that anything is certain, is that the big geopolitical shifts now happening will lead to a different kind of world in some way. And in that process of structural and agential change lies, the potential for things, to develop in one or another direction. In other words, time will tell. Whiteness has had, probably European American whiteness has had 500 years of ascendancy in one way or another. It won't be ascendant for the rest of human history. So I think we can take, some comfort in the fact that we can't control the future, but above all, it seems to me what we can do as intellectuals is be realistic about how things are. And Riyad has really helped us to be really clear about this central aspect of our current situation. And we're indebted to him for that. And we welcome his contributions to our webinar series, and we hope that we'll see him again. Thank you very, very much, Riyad. Been really great today, really clear, I think, in the way you unfolded those ideas. And I do recommend that everyone looks at the Shahjahan Edwards article in the journal Higher Education. It's well worth reading. Our next presenter is Soyoung Lee. And so this is going to create a small dilemma in our chat, because Soyoung is a great questioner and she will have to step aside from the questioning role to be a presenter next time. So in honor of your contribution to the questioning process, Soyoung, we'll have to organize some good questions for you. Soyoung's topic is, what do students do in higher education? Researching higher education as students' academic self-formation. It's an important study, important original study, and we look forward to hearing from Soyoung in 2 days' time. Thank you very much again, Riyad, and thank you everyone for participating in an important webinar, which will be well worth revisiting on YouTube. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.